It rose from the heart of Rome like a challenge carved into the sky. A stadium so vast it could swallow the roar of an entire city and throw it back as thunder. The Colosseum was not simply built. It was engineered to intimidate time itself, an oval mountain of stone and concrete, towering nearly 50 meters high, capable of holding more than 50,000 spectators in a world without engines, without steel beams, without the comfort of modern cranes. Even today, when we see its broken arches glowing at sunset, we forget what it truly represents. Not just a monument, but a system, political, logistical, and mechanical, designed to prove that Rome could command nature, labor, and fear, and shape them into architecture. And the most unsettling truth is this: it was completed with a speed and precision that still feels unnatural for an ancient empire. How do you drain a lake and lay a foundation stable enough to carry a structure weighing tens of thousands of tons? How do you move and raise mountains of travertine from distant quarries with nothing but rope, wood, human muscle, and a few ingenious machines? How do you weave arches and vaults into a hidden skeleton strong enough to hold crowds, earthquakes, and centuries, while also concealing an underground world of corridors, elevators, cages, and trapdoors, an arena that wasn't only a place to watch death, but a machine built to manufacture spectacle? The answer is not a single secret, but a chain of solutions, each one depending on the one before it. The ground must be conquered before the stone can rise. The stone must be lifted before the arches can lock. The arches must stand before the arena can become a weapon of power. In this video, we're going to follow that chain from its first decision, where the Colosseum was built and why, to the invisible engineering that made it possible, and finally to the human cost that paid for every block. By the end, the Colosseum won't feel like a romantic ruin anymore. It will feel like what it always was: Rome's greatest proof that nothing, not even the earth beneath their feet, was allowed to say no. The place where the Colosseum stands was never meant to hold stone. It was meant to hold water. Before the first block was set, this ground belonged to an emperor's private dream, Nero's Domus Aurea, where an artificial lake shimmered like a mirror for power, reflecting gardens, porticos, and the kind of luxury that made the city feel like it had been stolen from its own people. When Nero fell and the Flavian dynasty rose, the new rulers needed more than a building. They needed a statement that could be understood by anyone who walked the streets of Rome. So they chose the most symbolic act possible: erase the lake, fill the hollow, and replace a tyrant's pleasure with a public monument. Something vast enough to say that the center of the city no longer belonged to one man's ego, but to the crowd. Yet symbolism alone could not change the physics of the land. A lake bed is soft, soaked, unpredictable. It shifts, it swallows weight, it remembers every season of rain. To build here was to gamble the entire project on the one part of architecture no one celebrates, the part no one sees once the arches climb into the light. The engineers faced a problem that has humbled builders in every age. Water is patient, and the ground beneath it is rarely honest. If the foundation settled unevenly, the arena would crack. If the soil stayed waterlogged, walls would tilt. If the drainage failed, the entire structure would become a slow disaster disguised as progress. Rome's answer was not a miracle, but a method, refined across roads, aqueducts, and harbors. Control the landscape before you command it. They began by unmaking the lake the way an empire unmade old loyalties, systematically with channels, trenches, and a discipline that treated nature like an opponent. Water had to be redirected and released, not merely removed, and that meant carving pathways for it to leave and never return. Beneath the future amphitheater, they laid out drainage lines like veins, guiding runoff toward the city's existing sewers, tying the project into Rome's vast subterranean infrastructure. The same mindset that brought fresh water down from distant hills now drove dirty water away from the arena site, because a stadium is only as permanent as the dryness of the soil that supports it. Then came the true foundation, a ring designed to carry immense loads and spread them safely, like a giant stone anchor pressed into the earth. Here Rome relied on its quiet revolution: concrete. Not the modern kind mixed by trucks and poured into steel frames, but opus cementitium, a rough, stubborn blend of lime mortar and aggregate that could be packed, layered, and shaped into mass. With it, builders could create a base that behaved like carved rock, yet could be formed wherever the project demanded, filling weaknesses in the soil with a solid that bonded as it cured. Around and within the foundation, they set heavy travertine and tuff, not only for strength but for structure, because the Colosseum was conceived from the start as a system of rings, outer walls, inner supports, corridors, staircases, each one helping the next carry the weight of the whole. Every choice at this stage was about controlling forces before they became failures. The amphitheater's oval plan was not just elegant, it was strategic, a shape that helped distribute stress and resist uneven settling, as if the building were already anticipating the pressure of tens of thousands of bodies moving, shouting, and surging through its entrances. The foundation had to endure not only the static burden of stone, but the living burden of a city gathering in one place, turning architecture into a vessel for collective energy. And because the ground had once been water, the engineers built as if water might someday try to return, giving it roots to escape so the building would never have to fight it from within. When the base was finally ready, the Colosseum ceased to be an idea and became a commitment, the kind that cannot be undone without admitting defeat. The lake was gone, the earth was pinned down, and the outline of the arena was fixed like a mark pressed into wax. From that moment, everything depended on scale. Not just constructing walls, but feeding the site with stone, timber, and manpower in quantities so large they would have to move like a supply line in constant motion, because a foundation like this was only the beginning of the weight Rome intended to raise into the air. Once the ground had been tamed and the foundation sealed into the earth like an iron promise, the real strain began, because a foundation is only useful if you can feed it with mass. The Colosseum demanded an amount of material so enormous that it stopped being a construction site and became a moving organism, a project that had to be supplied every day, or it would starve. Travertine, the pale limestone that gives the amphitheater its famous brightness, did not come from a convenient pile nearby. It came from quarries at Tivoli, more than 20 kilometers away, where the stone lay in layered cliffs like pages of a book that had to be torn out one by one. Each block was extracted with patient violence, wedges driven into cut lines, fractures encouraged along the grain, surfaces dressed until they could sit flush against another stone, because in a building of this size, a small flaw becomes a crack that spreads, and a crack becomes a collapse that history remembers. Moving those blocks to Rome was its own campaign. Roads were the empire's bloodstream, and the Flavians used them the way generals used them, turning stone into cargo and cargo into routine. Ox-drawn carts groaned beneath loads that pushed wood and sinew to their limits, while teams of laborers guided rollers, stabilized slopes, and repaired ruts before the next shipment arrived. Some loads could be dragged on sledges over prepared tracks, lubricated with water or oil. The friction fought with the same stubborn persistence the Romans applied to everything that resisted them. It was slow, relentless work, measured not in minutes but in distances conquered. The next hill, the next bridge, the next gate into the city. And behind the practical method was a political certainty that made it possible. Rome could command bodies the way it commanded resources. Much of the heavy labor came from captives taken in war, especially after the Jewish revolt, people whose defeat was transformed into infrastructure, their strength absorbed into the stonework of a monument meant to entertain the very society that had crushed them. At the site, the problem changed shape. Transport could bring stone to the edge of the foundation, but it could not lift it into the sky. For that, Rome relied on machines that were simple in concept and terrifying in effect. Cranes powered by human weight. The treadwheel crane turned labor into leverage, using men walking inside a giant wooden wheel to wind ropes around a drum, raising loads that would otherwise require impossible force. With pulleys to multiply power and careful rigging to keep the stone steady, these cranes could lift blocks high enough to feed the rising rings of the amphitheater. The scene would have looked like controlled chaos. Ropes humming under tension, wooden frames creaking, foremen shouting signals, teams coordinating the slow ascent of each block as if the air itself were thick and the stone had to be persuaded to climb through it. Precision mattered as much as strength. The Colosseum was not built from random piles of rock. It was assembled like a puzzle on a monumental scale. Blocks had to meet at clean joints. Courses had to stay level. Curves had to remain true to the oval so that each arch aligned with the next. Roman builders used measuring cords, plumb lines, and sighting techniques refined on temples and aqueducts, and they marked stones so they could be placed where they belonged within the system. Metal clamps and dowels helped lock pieces together, while mortar and concrete filled voids where needed, binding the hidden core to the visible skin. Every lift had to be planned, because a swinging block could smash scaffolding, crush workers, or tear free from its rigging and fall with a finality that no apology could undo. Scaffolding rose alongside the walls like temporary forests. Platforms lashed together from timber, constantly extended upward as the structure climbed. Men worked at heights where a misstep meant death, carrying tools and stone, tying ropes, adjusting frames, and keeping the rhythm of the build moving forward. The amphitheater's outer wall, with its stacked arcades, was not merely decorative. It was a disciplined repetition designed for speed and stability, a pattern that allowed teams to specialize, repeating the same operations across dozens of identical segments. That repetition was Rome's advantage. Once a method worked for one bay, it could be replicated around the entire oval, turning complexity into routine and routine into acceleration. By the time the Colosseum's stone ribs began to define its silhouette, the project had already proven something essential. Rome did not need modern engines to move mountains. It needed organization strong enough to turn thousands of lives into one coordinated motion. Yet the most important strength of the amphitheater was not in the sheer amount of stone it consumed, but in the way that stone would be shaped into support, arched, vaulted, and interlocked, so the building could hold crowds like a living weight, not by resisting force with brute thickness, but by redirecting it through a hidden skeleton of geometry. Stone alone does not make a structure immortal. Stone must be taught how to carry weight. The Colosseum's true genius was not the size of its blocks, but the way those blocks were arranged into a disciplined language of arches and vaults, a geometry that turned gravity into something manageable, almost obedient. An arch is a negotiation with force. Instead of fighting downward pressure head-on, it divides it, pushes it sideways, and hands it off to supports that are ready to receive it. Multiply that principle hundreds of times, stack it in tiers, lock it into an oval, and you get a building that behaves less like a wall and more like a network, where each part is strengthened by the burden it shares with the others. This is why the amphitheater could be enormous without becoming clumsy, why it could endure earthquakes, fires, and centuries of stone theft and still remain recognizably itself. From the outside, the repetition of arcades looks like style, but it is really strategy. Each opening is an arch doing work, each pier a column of duty, each tier a rhythm that spreads load across the entire perimeter, rather than allowing it to concentrate in one fragile point. Behind the facade, corridors looped through the structure like channels in a carved hill, and staircases branched upward in predictable paths, guiding crowds with a clarity that feels modern because it is based on timeless logic. People move like water, and you must give them routes that prevent pressure from building into panic. The Colosseum's vomitoria, its wide entrances and exits, were not a joke in language, but a triumph of planning, enabling tens of thousands to enter, find their levels, and take their seats with a speed that would have been impossible in a simpler, more chaotic design. The building was not only meant to hold a crowd, it was meant to control it. But the real surprise lived beneath the sand. Under the arena floor lay the hypogeum, an underground world that turned the Colosseum from a stadium into a machine of transformation. Here, corridors and chambers formed a hidden city of logistics, where the spectacle was assembled before it was revealed. Cages, storage rooms, waiting pens, and narrow passages designed to keep dangerous animals and desperate men separated until the moment they were needed. This subterranean system, developed more fully in later phases, required the arena above to be more than a slab. It had to be a removable surface, a stage that could conceal motion and then betray it at the exact second the audience demanded surprise. Trapdoors were set like punctuation marks across the floor, ready to open without warning, and beneath them, platforms could rise on lifts powered by muscle, rope, and counterweight, pulling beasts and fighters upward as if the earth itself were delivering offerings to the crowd. The elevators were not myth. They were the practical extension of Rome's obsession with control. A vertical lift in an ancient context is a risky thing, because any failure is immediate and violent. Yet the Romans built them anyway, relying on winches, pulleys, and teams trained to move in unison. Timing mattered here as much as strength. A lion that appears too early ruins the illusion. A trapdoor that sticks turns drama into confusion. A lift that jerks can injure the performer before the performance even begins. Every mechanism demanded maintenance, coordination, and discipline, and that meant the Colosseum required not just builders, but operators, an ongoing workforce that kept the machine alive long after the last stone was set. Above ground, the vaults that supported seating and corridors were equally functional, turning interior spaces into structural reinforcement. Barrel vaults stretched like stone tunnels. Groin vaults intersected to distribute load more efficiently, and together they created a lattice that could carry the layered weight of spectators, marble seats, and the constant vibration of movement. These vaults also made the building breathable, allowing air to flow and people to circulate, because crowd comfort was part of control. A trapped crowd becomes an angry crowd, and Rome's emperors did not build this monument to invite anger. Even the seating plan reinforced the machine's purpose, arranging society into visible order. The closer you were to the arena, the more power you had, and the further you climbed, the more you became part of the anonymous mass. The architecture taught the audience their place without a single word spoken. And still, the machine demanded more than geometry. It demanded materials, money, and above all, human endurance, not only from the architects who conceived it, but from the bodies that carried, cut, lifted, and maintained it. Every arch is a solution, but every solution has a cost, and the Colosseum's cost was paid in the currency Rome had in endless supply: the spoils of conquest and the lives of the conquered. The Colosseum was presented as a gift, but it was financed like a victory. Its stones rose in the afterglow of conquest, when Rome's armies returned not only with banners and prisoners, but with treasure torn from defeated cities, wealth converted into public grandeur to prove that empire could turn violence into architecture. The Flavian dynasty understood that legitimacy in Rome was never inherited in peace. It had to be manufactured in the eyes of the crowd, and nothing manufactured loyalty faster than a monument that made the people feel included. The amphitheater promised access, seats, shade, entertainment, the illusion of equality inside a shared spectacle. Yet every part of that promise was built on inequality so absolute it became invisible. The same system that could drain a lake, haul stone, and engineer vaults also had the power to reduce human beings into fuel, replacing exhaustion with replacement, grief with silence. Much of the labor that fed this project came from those who had no choice. Captives taken in war were absorbed into the empire's workforce, their defeat recast as duty, their names erased into numbers. They cut stone, pulled carts, walked tread wheels, cleared rubble, and carried loads through dust and heat until their bodies learned the rhythm of obedience. Even skilled workers, masons, carpenters, riggers, operated under a hierarchy as strict as a military chain of command, where mistakes were punished because delays were political and politics was survival. A fractured block, a snapped rope, a collapsed scaffold did not merely kill, it threatened the narrative the emperors were selling, the story that Rome's new rulers were restoring order and giving back what Nero had stolen. The Colosseum had to be finished because it was propaganda made solid, and propaganda cannot hesitate. And then there was what the building was made for. Once the last stones were set and the seats arranged, the arena did not become a quiet temple of civic pride. It became a stage where the empire rehearsed its dominance in front of itself. Spectacles filled the space with controlled terror: animal hunts, executions, staged battles, gladiatorial contests that turned human life into an instrument for applause. The engineering that created the hypogem was matched by the social engineering that filled it. Men trained to fight, beasts imported to die, prisoners condemned for entertainment, all timed and released like parts in a performance. What looked like chaos in the sand was, behind the scenes, carefully managed supply and demand. Animals had to be sourced and transported, fighters had to be trained and housed, weapons had to be standardized, medical staff had to patch bodies that could be sent back into the arena because a good investment was not wasted after one injury. The crowd's experience was designed to feel effortless, but the system supporting it was vast. Tens of thousands entered through numbered arches, filtered into corridors, climbed stairways, and emerged at the correct level without understanding they were being guided by architecture like water in channels. Order was maintained not only by guards, but by the building itself, which separated classes into tiers so society could see itself arranged like a diagram. Senators close enough to watch expressions, equestrians just beyond, citizens in ascending rings, and those with the least power, women, the poor, the enslaved, pushed upward into the highest seats where the city became a distant roar. It was inclusion with a hierarchy carved into stone, a reminder that Rome could gather everyone into one place and still keep everyone exactly where the empire wanted them. Even the comforts were political. The great awning, the velarium, stretched overhead like a moving sky, shading the crowd with fabric hauled and controlled by sailors skilled in rigging, because Rome understood that comfort buys patience, and patience buys loyalty. Free distributions of food and the promise of entertainment softened hunger and resentment, making the people feel rewarded, while the underlying message remained constant. The emperor provides, the emperor controls, the emperor decides who lives and who dies in the center of the city. The Colosseum did not merely host violence, it framed it, ritualized it, and made it communal, so that domination became a shared experience rather than a distant rumor from the frontiers. Yet the most haunting part is how perfectly all the layers fit together. The foundation built on drained water made a stable platform for stone. The stone lifted by muscle and machine formed arches that carried the crowd. The arches and vaults supported an underground system that produced surprise and terror. And the entire machine existed to convert conquest into legitimacy, pain into applause, death into unity. The Colosseum endures because it was built with genius, but it also endures as a reminder that genius is not always gentle, and that the greatest monuments of empire are often the most polished masks worn by power.